History has a kill switch, a specific recurring sequence that has systematically annihilated every single global reserve currency in the last 6 centuries. Not some of them, all of them, without exception. The Portuguese Real held the throne of global commerce for 80 years before it disintegrated. The Dutch guilder ruled the world's markets for 80 years, then vanished into irrelevance. The British pound sterling dictated the terms of trade for 105 years, until it died a painful death. Do you see the timeline? Each of these empires followed the exact same 7-stage roadmap to destruction. Each one of them was arrogant enough to believe they were the exception. Each empire thought their dominance was eternal, and every single one of them was dead wrong. Here is the reality check that should keep you awake at night. The United States dollar was crowned the world's reserve currency in 1944. That was exactly 81 years ago. We have now hit the mathematical average lifespan of a fiat empire. And right now, in 2025, the data confirms we are not approaching the cliff, we are already falling. The dollar is deep inside stage 5 of this 7-stage death spiral. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't doom-mongering. This is cold, hard mathematics. This sequence has played out 4 times across 600 years of human history. The only question remaining is not will it happen, but rather, are you intelligent enough to recognize the pattern before the final crash, or are you arrogant enough to bet against history? In this video, I am going to decode the pattern for you. I will walk you through the 7 specific stages that every reserve currency endures, and I will pinpoint exactly where the dollar sits at this very second. Before we unlock this timeline and show you how to survive the transition, make sure you are positioned to see the signs that others miss. Crush that subscribe button and hit the notification bell right now. When stage 6 accelerates, you will want to be the first to know, not the last. Let's begin. To understand the magnitude of this collapse, you first have to understand what a reserve currency actually is. It is not just having a stable stack of cash. It is the ultimate economic weapon. It is the currency that foreign central banks are forced to hoard. It is the unit of account used to price the blood of the global economy, oil, gold, and commodities. When you possess the reserve currency, the entire planet is hostage to your money. If a nation wants to buy energy, they need your currency. To settle debts, they need your currency. To store their national savings, they buy your bonds. This creates a phenomenon economists call exorbitant privilege. It is the closest thing to magic in the financial world. You can simply print paper money and export it abroad to purchase real, tangible goods. Cars, electronics, raw materials flow into your country, and all you send back is printed paper. You can run massive, endless trade deficits because the world has no choice but to accumulate your currency. You can borrow trillions at rock-bottom interest rates because the demand for your debt is structural, not optional. Being the reserve currency holder is the throne of the world. It is why empires wage wars to achieve it, and it is exactly why they implode when they lose it. Now, let's dissect the anatomy of the collapse. Stage 1. Military dominance and the stranglehold on trade. Every single reserve currency cycle begins in blood and gunpowder. It starts with overwhelming military superiority that does one specific thing. It controls the global trade routes. It's not enough to have a strong army. You must control the arteries of global commerce. Go back to the 1,450 seconds. Portugal did the impossible. They mastered the science of oceanic navigation, while the rest of Europe was terrified of the horizon. By 1488, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, unlocking a direct vein to Asia's wealth, bypassing the land routes controlled by the Ottoman Empire. But they didn't just map the ocean. They militarized it. Portuguese warships didn't just sail. They dominated. From the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, they built fortified choke points at Goa, Malacca, and Macau. These weren't friendly ports. They were armed fortresses. Portuguese cannons dictated who could trade and who would sink. If you wanted spices, you paid Portugal. If you wanted to move goods, you needed their permission. This military stranglehold made the Portuguese real the only currency that mattered. It wasn't backed by economics, it was backed by artillery. The Dutch copied this blueprint perfectly in the 1600s. The Dutch East India Company wasn't a business. It was a sovereign military force, with 40 warships and a private army of 20,000 soldiers. They seized the spice trade by force, turning Amsterdam into the warehouse of the world. If you wanted to participate in global commerce, you used the guilder, because the Dutch Navy owned the seas. Then came the British in the 1800s. They scaled this model to global domination. Britannia rules the waves wasn't a song. It was a geopolitical reality. The Royal Navy possessed more firepower than the next 5 nations combined. They locked down every strategic choke point on Earth: Gibraltar, Suez, Singapore, Malacca. The pound sterling became the global standard not by choice, but by the sheer force of the British Navy ensuring that trade could not happen without it. And finally, the United States. After World War II, America didn't just inherit this mantle, it seized it. The U.S. Navy today patrols every ocean with 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, a force projection unequal in human history. America controls the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez, the Panama Canal. This military umbrella effectively forces global trade to operate within the American system. This is stage 1, military dominance securing the trade routes. The U.S. achieved this in 1945. Check. But military dominance inevitably leads to the accumulation of staggering wealth, which triggers stage 2. Stage 2. Massive trade surpluses and the accumulation of global wealth. Once you control the oceans, you don't just secure trade, you dictate the flow of the world's capital. This is the golden era, the phase where the empire becomes a magnet for wealth. It isn't necessarily theft, it is extreme leverage. The reserve currency nation produces goods that the rest of the world is desperate to buy, creating a tsunami of incoming gold and capital. Look at the Portuguese in the 1500s. They executed a masterclass in arbitrage. They bought spices and silk in Asia for pennies and sold them in Europe for ransoms. The balance of trade tilted violently toward Lisbon. The city didn't just get rich, it became the vault of Europe. The revenue was so immense that the government didn't even need to tax its own citizens heavily. The trade surplus paid for everything. The Dutch refined this in the 1600s. Amsterdam became the inventory room of the planet. They bought low in one hemisphere and sold high in the other. They weren't just merchants, they were global middlemen. The surplus capital was so extreme that Amsterdam's canals were lined with mansions built on spice profits. Britain in the 1800s took it a step further. They became the workshop of the world. They exported finished steel, textiles, and ships. They imported cheap raw materials. The terms of trade were set in London. The surplus capital built the city of London into the financial heart of the globe. And the United States? From 1945 to 1970, America experienced the greatest trade surplus in human history. With Europe and Asia reduced to rubble, the U.S. was the only factory left standing. We exported cars, steel, and machinery to everyone. Dollars flowed out, but gold flowed in. By the 1,950 seconds, Fort Knox held 20,000 tons of gold, more than all other nations combined. This was the zenith, the high water mark. But here is where the tragedy begins. Because stage 2 never lasts, it breeds a fatal arrogance. Eventually, the reserve currency nation gets tired of producing and starts enjoying the fruits of its dominance. This leads inevitably to stage 3. Stage 3. The formalization of reserve status. The trap. At a certain point, the world stops fighting your dominance and officially codifies it. Treaties are signed. Systems are built around your currency. This looks like the ultimate victory, but in reality, it is the tipping point into decline. For Portugal, the world accepted the real as the standard unit of account. For the Dutch, the guilder became the currency of international contracts. For Britain, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 cemented the pound sterling as the king of currencies. For the United States, this trap was set at Bretton Woods in 1944. 44 nations gathered and agreed. The dollar is the anchor. All other currencies peg to the dollar pegs to gold. It seemed like a permanent victory, but this created a fatal economic paradox known as the Triffin dilemma. Here is the simple, terrifying logic of the Triffin dilemma. To be the world's reserve currency, you must provide the world with your money so they can use it for trade. To get your money into their hands, you must send it abroad. And the only way to send it abroad at scale is to buy their goods. You must stop being a net exporter and start being a net importer. You cannot be the world's factory and the world's bank at the same time. The moment reserve status is formalized, the countdown clock starts. The nation stops making things and starts financing things. This pushes the empire blindly into stage 4. Stage 4, deficit spending and the hollowing out. This is the point of no return. The reversal happens. The nation shifts from producing wealth to consuming the wealth it accumulated in the past. It feels like prosperity, but it is actually liquidation. Portugal hit this wall in the mid-1500s. Their trade surplus vanished. Instead of making things, they imported everything: grain, clothes, weapons, paid for with the gold they had already mined. They were burning the furniture to heat the house. The king spent lavishly on palaces and cathedrals, blind to the fact that the productive engine had stalled. The Dutch followed the same path in the 1700s. Why work in a factory when you are the richest people on earth? They shifted from trade to finance. They became bankers, lending money to foreign governments instead of building ships. It generated passive income, but it hollowed out their industrial base. They were eating their own seed corn. Britain in the early 1900s mirrored this perfectly. By 1900, the British trade deficit was structural. They imported food and machines while their own factories grew old and obsolete, outpaced by Germany and America. They financed this lifestyle by living off the dividends of the empire they built a century earlier. In the United States, we entered stage 4 in 1971. That was the year the trade surplus died. We shifted from a production economy to a consumption economy. By the 1980 seconds, the deficits were growing. By the 2000s, we were running the largest trade deficits in the history of our species, hemorrhaging nearly $1 trillion a year to buy cheap goods from abroad. We gutted the Rust Belt. We shipped our manufacturing base overseas. We replaced factories with financial derivatives. We financed our lifestyle not by making better products, but by printing the reserve currency that the world was forced to accept. This works for a while. It feels like magic. You get real TVs, real cars, and real oil, and you give them paper in return. But eventually, the bill comes due. And when you can no longer borrow enough to cover your gluttony, you resort to the desperate measure of Stage 5. Stage 5, currency debasement and the printing press. This is exactly where we are today. When the deficits become mathematically unsustainable, when the debt becomes too large to service through taxation, the empire has only one move left: debase the currency. Print the money. Portugal did it in the 1,550 seconds. They lowered the silver content in their coins, stealing value from every holder of the currency. The result? Inflation. Prices skyrocketed. Trust evaporated. The Dutch did it in the 1700s. To pay for wars they couldn't afford, they inflated the guilder. The value of their money collapsed, and international merchants started looking for an exit. Britain did it through 2 world wars. They broke the gold peg, printed pounds to pay for the war machine, and obliterated the purchasing power of the British saver. By the 1,970 seconds, the pound was a shadow of its former self. The United States entered Stage 5 in 2008. The great financial crisis broke the system. To stop the bleeding, the Federal Reserve printed money on a scale that defied imagination. Quantitative easing. $3.5 trillion conjured out of thin air. Then came 2020. Another $7 trillion printed in 24 months. We created more dollars in 2 years than in the previous 2 centuries of the Republic combined. This is debasement. It isn't shaving silver off coins anymore. It's adding zeros to a digital ledger. But the result is identical. The purchasing power of your salary, your savings, and your retirement fund is being siphoned off to pay for the debts of the state. Inflation is not an accident. It is the policy. It is the only way a Stage 5 empire can keep the lights on. But you cannot print your way to prosperity. You can only print your way to a crisis of confidence. And that crisis triggers the most dangerous phase of all. Stage 6, loss of confidence and the global exodus. This is the tipping point, the moment the illusion shatters. It is when the rest of the world looks at the reserve currency holder bloated with debt, addicted to printing money, and quietly decides to find the exit door. They stop trusting your paper and start demanding real assets. History shows us exactly how this looks. Portugal lost confidence in the 1,580 seconds. International merchants stopped accepting the debased real and demanded payment in Spanish silver or Venetian ducats. The Portuguese currency didn't just lose value, it lost utility. It became useless outside of its own borders. The British pound faced this reckoning after World War II. In 1945, the pound made up over 60% of global reserves, but the world saw Britain's debt. They saw the printing. In 1949, Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30% overnight. If you held British debt, you lost 1/3 of your wealth while you slept. Confidence evaporated. Within 15 years, the pound was a relic. And the US dollar? We are living in the early chapters of Stage 6 right now. The signs are flashing red, but the mainstream media is ignoring them. Look at the data. Central banks around the world are dumping dollars at a record pace. The dollar's share of global reserves has plummeted from 72% in 2000 to 58% in 2024. That is a 14% collapse. It might sound small, but that represents trillions of dollars of buying power vanishing. Where is that money going? Gold. Central banks bought more gold in the last 2 years than at any time since 1967. China is hoarding it. Russia has liquidated its US treasuries to buy it. Why? Because gold cannot be printed by the Federal Reserve. It has no counterparty risk. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is openly building a parallel financial system to bypass the dollar. In 2023, Saudi Arabia did the unthinkable. They began accepting Chinese yuan for oil. This signaled the death rattle of the petrodollar system that has propped up the American economy for 50 years. The world is not waiting for the collapse. They are actively positioning for it. They are building lifeboats while the band plays on the Titanic. This search for alternatives triggers the final, fatal sequence. Stage 7. The replacement and the total collapse. This is the endgame. The moment the music stops. A new currency rises to take the throne. Not by a vote, but by market force. The old currency doesn't just decline, it is abandoned. In the late 1500s, the Spanish silver peso crushed the Portuguese real because Spain controlled the silver mines of the Americas. The market chose silver over debased Portuguese paper. In the 1800s, the British pound suffocated the Dutch guilder because London became the undisputed center of industrial capital. In the 1940 seconds, the dollar buried the pound because America held the world's gold in the world's factories. The transition is always brutal. It destroys the middle class of the falling empire. Savings evaporate, pensions become worthless, purchasing power falls off a cliff. But here is the terrifying variable that makes our current situation unique. This is why you should be truly scared. Every previous collapse was regional. When the real collapsed, it hurt Portugal. When the guilder collapsed, it hurt the Netherlands. But the US dollar is different. It is the operating system of the entire planet. Every barrel of oil, every ounce of gold, every ton of wheat is priced in dollars. Corporate debt in emerging markets is denominated in dollars. The banking systems of Japan, Europe, and South America are built on dollar collateral. If the dollar collapses, it won't be a recession. It will be a global systemic reset. It will be a financial heart attack for the world economy. There is no clear successor ready to take the throne. The euro is fractured. The yuan is trapped by capital controls. Bitcoin is too volatile. Gold is too scarce to facilitate trillions in daily trade. We are heading into a vacuum, a period of chaos where no single currency rules and multiple systems compete for dominance. This means extreme volatility. It means supply chains breaking. It means the kind of inflation that turns a paycheck into dust before you can spend it. The pattern tells us we have maybe 10 to 15 years before the final act of Stage 7 completes. But if the loss of confidence accelerates, if a geopolitical war breaks out or another financial crisis forces the Fed to print another 10 trillion, that timeline could shrink to 5 years or less. So, the question is no longer if. The question is, what do you do? How do you survive when the money you use to measure your wealth is the very thing that is dying? So, what is the strategy? How do you protect your legacy when the system resets? The first step is a mental shift. You must realize that in a Stage 5 empire, holding cash is not playing it safe. It is a guaranteed loss. The dollar is melting. Since 2020, inflation has already silently stolen a quarter of your purchasing power. That isn't a market fluctuation. That is the mathematical certainty of a currency being debased to keep the system alive. Your savings account is leaking value every single second you leave it exposed. Second, you must decouple your wealth from the fiat illusion. I am not telling you to panic, sell everything, and live in a bunker. That is fear, not strategy. I am telling you to trade paper promises for real things. History rewards those who hold hard assets that exist outside the banking ledger. Real estate, productive businesses, commodities, gold. These are the lifeboats. These assets hold value regardless of whose face is on the currency or what happens to the exchange rate. When the Portuguese real died, the land remained. When the Dutch guilder vanished, the businesses remained. When the paper burns, the real assets survive. Third, you must watch the signals. The pattern is screaming at us, but you have to know where to look. Watch the central bank reserves data. Watch the bilateral trade agreements between nations that exclude the dollar. If you see the global exodus accelerate, you know the timeline is shrinking. The harsh reality is that breaking this pattern would require the United States to do something politically impossible. Stop the spending, end the deficits. Rebuild the industrial base from scratch. It would require accepting short-term economic pain for long-term stability. But democracies do not vote for pain. They vote for stimulus. They vote for the printing press. They choose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. So the pattern will continue. Stage 6 will accelerate into Stage 7. The only variable left is you. Most people will ignore this warning. They will scroll past, choosing the comfort of the illusion over the discomfort of the truth. They will be the liquidity that transfers wealth to those who prepared. They will be the victims of history. Don't be them. The transition has already begun. The cracks in the foundation are visible to anyone willing to look. This channel exists for one singular purpose: to decode the timeline before it crushes us. We are tracking the collapse of the old order and the birth of the new one in real time. If you want to be part of the minority who prepares rather than the majority who panics, you know what to do. Click that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Do not let the next crisis catch you sleeping. History has shown us the end of this movie 4 times already. We know how it ends. The only question is, where will you be standing when the credits roll? I'll see you in the next video.